This is In the Money.
Welcome to In the Money. I'm Susan Lesovich, sitting in for Jack Cafferty. Coming up on today's program, Help Wanted. Washington gives aid to Africa, but now it's being asked to send much more. Find out if America is giving enough or too much. Plus, so much for the old school sales pitch. Procter & Gamble may be cutting back on some of its network commercials. See if the TV ad still has what it takes to move a product. And the mild-mannered moneymaker. Sex and violence may catch the eye, but a new study says G-rated movies can deliver the best returns on investment. We'll look at why Hollywood isn't making more of them. Joining me today, a couple of In the Money veterans. Lou Dobbs Tonight correspondent Christine Romans and Money.com managing editor Alan Wasser. So 6 months into President Bush's second term, you'd think that after that nasty election, that now that we've had the Iraqi interim elections, that maybe some of the worst stuff is behind him. President Bush scores one of the lowest poll ratings ever of his presidency, 42%, and Congress, just 1/3 of Americans surveyed in the CBS New York Times poll say they approve the way Congress has handled itself.
Just 1/3. I mean, that's amazing to think that so few people think that their congressmen and women are doing a good job. It's interesting. I'm listening to a lot of these border security and immigration hearings on the Hill for my job on Lou Dobbs Tonight, and what I keep hearing from these folks is that their constituents are saying what they're hearing out of Washington is not what their biggest concerns are. They have bigger concerns
out of touch.
Absolutely out of touch on Social Security and a lot of other issues as well. They're really concerned about day-to-day security issues, not necessarily some of the financial things coming out of the White House, Social Security in particular. They just say that they don't think that their congressmen and women and their president is doing what they want. More and more people are saying that.
I'll agree that we've had a lot of instances of Congress behaving badly this year. In a number of different issues. But I'm going to defend the Bush administration a little bit here, because once you're elected, that's the time to start getting tough with people and doing things that might not be so popular. So if you're going to do it now. This might be part of the game plan.
Well, and that's a very good point, because when you want to talk about a tough time, President Bush has had a really tough time with Social Security, so much so that just this week the president said, reforming the tax code, it's going to take a little bit longer. And for a lot of people, boy, when we remember doing our taxes this season, that alternative minimum tax,
right?
Ouch.
Mm-hmm. Well, another to play devil's advocate as well. There are a lot of folks who say the White House doesn't respond to the country, the White House leads the country. Your lawmakers are supposed to be out there pushing things ahead for you, and then public opinion and public sentiment falls along.
Well, we'll see how it goes in the midterm elections, because one of the biggest drops came from among Republicans surveyed in this poll.
Big
okay, and yet other issues to talk about is foreign aid. Nobody gives more money to Africa than the United States, but Washington's under pressure these days to spend even more, and that might be not just nice, but smart. After all, what goes on in Africa can affect life here, from what we pay at the pump to our security. Last week, British Prime Minister Tony Blair failed to convince President Bush to back a $25 billion plan for countries to double their African aid. But Mr. Blair is expected to keep pushing that idea at next month's G8 summit in Scotland. For a look at what the U.S. already gives to Africa and whether it should crank up the donations, we're joined by Chamberlain Peterside. He's the founder and president of New Era Capital Corporation, an investment advisory firm. Welcome.
Thank you.
So put it in perspective for us. By all measures, the United States gives the most to funding overseas. But in terms of percentages for how rich this country is in terms of its GDP, it's a different story.
That's right. You're right. As a percentage of U.S. GDP, it gives less than 0.5%, as opposed to some countries in Europe that give as much as 1% of their GDP. U.S. is a signatory to the UN Pact that says that at least 0.7 advanced countries' GDP should be given as aids to poor countries in Africa and Asia and Latin America. That is an issue which is worth addressing. Prime Minister Blair had introduced a plan that would double aid to Africa to at least $25 billion every year. President Bush had responded to that, and that response wasn't quite enough. This last week, New York Times called that crumbs. Now, what we're saying is that apart from the aids that should be channeled to Africa, there has to be a smart way of channeling those aids. AIDS per se is a surgical strike. on Africa's problem. Investments and trade, I think, is what the focus should be going
So
forward.
we need to talk about how to use those dollars. And you can argue about whether, the United States percentage-wise is giving as much as some other countries, but a dollar spent in Africa, whether it's, X percent of GDP or more percent of GDP, it's still $1 spent in Africa. It's how you use that money that's the most important thing. Some of the criticisms I've heard is that the United States and other countries, feeding people and sending all this money, it goes into the pockets of despots and dictators, and that the people of Africa don't get any more help when more money is spent. How do you fix that?
Well, the problem of corruption, it's quite serious in Africa. Unfortunately, that is not endemic to the people. Corruption is not part of the culture. It's been able to thrive based on the weak infrastructure, based on the weak institutions. So I think that the focus should be that if you're going to support, then you have to support democratic reforms. You've got to support market reforms. You've got to help build new institutions, empower people to be able to get job opportunities. The stronger you have the institutions in Africa, the less likely that those funds and those aids are going to be frittered away. And remember that a third of Africa's private savings is held abroad. So a lot of those same funds that are being donated and that are being supposedly corruptly taken abroad are things that should have been in the system. So we're saying redirect the aids, create new growth opportunities, and support the new growth engines, small and medium-scale enterprises, assist the local people who are able to get loans on very concessionary terms and be able to get into the formal sector.
So, Mr. Peterside, then, that echoes a lot of what the Bush administration has been saying about what they would like to accomplish with aid to Africa. Meanwhile, you have Tony Blair arguing, okay, let's throw more money at them. Which policies is more likely to succeed, and which one politically is more likely to succeed?
I think that there's one problem, which is insufficient resources. Now, Tony Blair's policies that provide more resources, but President Bush approaches, where do you channel those resources? There has to be a marriage of these two concepts. If you're able to provide more funds directly towards the new growth engines, microcredit, small and medium-scale enterprises, building strong democratic institutions, it is likely that you would not need to provide food aid whenever there's famine or whenever there's any emergencies. The surgical strikes that we have seen in the past has not helped Africa, so we're not advocating for aid per se. We're saying that any new funds, be it from Britain or from the U.S., should be channeled towards growing the small and medium-scale enterprises, microcredits.
Mr. Peterside, I was in Kenya 10 years ago to report on the African Trade and Opportunity Act, which has since passed, where, in fact, you weren't teaching Africans, you weren't giving them fish, you were teaching them how to fish. You were breaking down those trade barriers. Everybody there that I spoke to said this is what this continent needs to get on a more level playing field. What's happened? It's been at least 5 years now since that act was passed. What's happened? What are the results of that?
Indeed, the African Growth and Opportunities Act, AGOA Act, has actually helped to galvanize production in a lot of African countries. In fact, last time, the president of Uganda, Museveni, called it one of the best things to come out of Africa. It's helped create 11,000 job opportunities in Lesotho. It's helped create a lot of factories that now export. Unfortunately, not a lot of the small businesses within the system are taking advantage of that. Any new support, any new aid money should go towards providing funding for these small and medium-scale enterprises that will be able to take advantage of programs like the AGOA. You also have a program like the African Mortgage Market Initiative, which is also very sound by the U.S. policy, by the U.S. administration to help create new homes, affordable homes, and mortgage financing.
We know how successful certainly those kind of programs have been here when it comes to getting people into their homes and providing some initial security. Chamberlain, Peterside, I would imagine it's just a victory to get African back on the talking table at the G8. That in itself is a victory. Chamberlain, Peterside is the founder and president of New Era Capital Corporation. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
When we come back.
Whitfield at the CNN Center in Atlanta. In the Money begins in a moment, but first, a check of the headlines.